Anthea, let me
Done,
know.
Rosaline.
You want to start recording? Are we fine to record?
Yes,
Okay,
we're done.
thank you. Okay. So, welcome everyone. We want to start because Dr. Blackie has to leave in an hour's time. She's got another appointment. So, Taban, if you can help to please mute. I can hear my voice. So if you all can please mute.
You're muted, Rosaline.
Rosaline, you muted.
Muted me now.
There you go. Can you hear you now?
Okay. No, I think someone muted me because I'd unmuted before I. Okay. So welcome on behalf of the HELTASA Executive Committee and the Professional Learning Project team. It is my pleasure to accord a very, very warm welcome to you. For those of you who don't know, my name is Rosaline Govender, and I am the project manager of the Professional Learning Project team, so known as PLP. So when you receive all those emails with PLP, remember it's Professional Learning Project. My other team members are Dr. Anthea Jacobs from Stellenbosch University and Mr. Tabang Mufakwani from the University of Johannesburg. Today's webinar is in keeping with the HELTASA 2021 unconference theme, Sivela P, CP, CRP, shape-shifting past experiences, current realities, and future possibilities. This webinar explores the connections that can be made between how we assess students in STEM disciplines and nurturing an orientation to wider society. So I'm actually very excited to be part of this webinar and to learn more as well. We're very, very honored that Dr. Blackie, Margaret Blackie, has accepted our invite to present at today's webinar. And I hand you over now to Dr. Anthea Jacobs, who will now introduce our guest speaker. Thank you. Over to you, Anthea.
There we go. Thanks so much for that warm welcome, Rosaline. And from my side as well, colleagues, good afternoon and a warm welcome to you all. It's lovely to see so many of you in the virtual audience. And I trust that this afternoon's webinar will indeed be an enriching experience for all of you. All right, so my name is Anthea Jacobs, as Rosaline mentioned earlier on. I am affiliated to Stellenbosch University, and it is indeed an honor to introduce my colleague and the speaker for today, Dr. Margaret Blackie. Allow me to just read out to you her brief biography. So Dr. Margaret Blackie is a senior lecturer in the Department of Chemistry and Polymer Science at Stellenbosch University. She was the recipient of the South African Chemical Institute's Education Medal, that's a mouthful, and the SU Teaching Award in the Distinguished Teacher category in 2020. She also holds the Stellenbosch University Teaching Fellowship, and she has research interests in synthetic chemistry and in education. And she teaches chemistry in the Department of Chemistry and Polymer Science at Stellenbosch University. So her talk for today is entitled Can and Should Assessment Nurture and Orientation to Society and Social Justice? And from the topic, I think it should be clear to all of you that she indeed also has an interest in social justice. So Dr. Blackie will speak for about 30 minutes, and thereafter we will have time for questions and answers. Also, just before I hand over to her, to say that I got to know Dr. Blackie as a passionate scholar and an engaging speaker, and I know today's webinar will be no different. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Dr. Blackie. A warm welcome. Over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Anthea. I'm just going to sort out screen sharing. Here we go. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides now, and I'll just put it onto actual slideshow.
Great stuff,
Great.
Max. Can see it.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for the invitation to talk on this topic. Firstly, I just want to say this topic comes from, or this presentation comes from a paper that I've written jointly with Jan MacArthur from Lancaster University, Nicole Peterson from Virginia Tech, and Kaylee Rosewell from Lancaster. And to be honest, in terms of this presentation, full credit must go to the lead author, who was Jan MacArthur, on this particular paper. But the four of us have worked quite closely on this project. So if you want to see the full paper that was accepted into assessment and evaluation in higher education a little bit earlier on this year, probably about a month ago, I think. So you can find the full paper of this presentation as you can see here. Just to give some context of where this particular paper comes from, it comes from actually a large longitudinal study where we tracked 4 years chemistry and chemical engineering students through 4 years of their undergraduate programs in England, the United States, and South Africa. In fact, there's a much larger project team comprising, I won't mention all the names, but the key person there is the principal investigator, Paul Ashwin. Without sort of his inspiration for this project, none of the work presented here would have happened. And some of you may be aware of a project that Paul did with a couple of other people in tracking sociology students some years ago. And in some sense, this is a follow-on project to that, but it's a much more complex project because it tracks chemistry and chemical engineering students. And of course, it tracks 6 different programs across 3 different countries. So just to give you some sense of the magnitude of this project, as I said, it's 6. We're tracking 6 institutions, chemistry and chemical engineering. In the first year, we interviewed 25 students from each program. And essentially, there wasn't really a selection process here. We simply invited students and kept inviting them until we got around about 25 students from each program. And then in years 2 to 4, we selected 10 students from those original 25 and followed those through to their final years. If the students switched program in year 3, we then simply followed them wherever they went. So provided in year 2 they were still within the program, they were still welcome to be part of the study. But I think just the simple maths on that means that there's a total possible of 660 interviews. For those of you who have done any kind of qualitative data will understand the magnitude of this project. It is simply enormous. So the way in which we've chosen to work in this project is to divide into several different project teams. So for example, on this project, this is the society theme, and that comprises myself, Jan MacArthur, Nicole Peterson, and Kaylee Rosewell. And this paper is one of several papers that we're currently working on within the society theme. So just to talk about those themes a little bit, the curriculum team are looking at the differences in curricula across the different institutions. Knowledge, there's some really kind of very interesting stuff emerging in terms of knowledge, in terms of looking at how students develop in their understanding of either chemistry or chemical engineering through those years of study. Study practices, Jenny Case is leading that team, and that's very much looking at how students cope with the studies, with their work. And then the personal project theme is being led up by Renee Smith, and that's looking at really the development of identity and sense of self in students. So the detail, I'll talk a little bit about the detail of how we came to look at this particular project in a minute. So I'm going to kind of situate this particular paper theoretically, and the society team has chosen to follow very much the twin aspects of social justice using critical theory, following the school of both Hanath and Adorno. And essentially what we're looking at here, obviously there's more to it than this, but essentially this is our starting point. And that's the quote from Hanath there. What is just is that which allows the individual member of our society to realize his or her own life objectives in cooperation with others and with the greatest possible autonomy. So it's kind of that both and of the significance of the individual, but the fact that the individual must be in some kind of relationship with society. So we see there that quote, this is a quote, in fact, from the paper, a person who does not look beyond their own well-being and consider broader social well-being is unable to realize their individual well-being. So this is really the departure point of this paper. So we're bringing this lens is being brought to bear on the data rather than a sort of a grounded research approach to the data. And one of the reasons for this is inspired by Nancy Fraser, is that the purpose increasingly is to think the unthinkable. Is it in one sense what we're looking at there is, if we want a socially just society, where do we see that social justice element emerging in particularly chemistry and chemical engineering? And if we're not seeing it in assessment, where might it be? And the focus on social justice and assessment comes very much from the work of Jan MacArthur herself, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the first thing I want to do is sort of situate assessment in STEM, or certainly in the environments that we were looking at here in chemistry and in chemical engineering. What tends to happen is that certainly in the earlier years of those degrees, and certainly probably throughout the whole of a chemistry degree, the main focus of assessment is to ensure that the foundational concepts and principles are in place. And this is important, obviously, because in Bernsteinian terms, this is very much a hierarchical knowledge structure. So we need to make sure that the building blocks are set in first year, and then such that the building blocks in second year can be built on top of them, and so on. In all of the programs that we looked at, it was quite clear that there is a regular assessment happens in the first year, and those assessments tend to be relatively small and constrained in first year, where towards later years in the project, it builds much more to project-based work in later years in those degrees. So as I said, this builds very much on the work of Jan MacArthur, and as she's the lead author on this paper, this is really no big surprise here. So Jan, this is a picture of one of Jan's books, Assessment for Social Justice, and her argument is that there's an interrelationship between students seeing their achievements in terms of their well-being of others, in terms of the well-being of others and their own well-being. And this may be a slightly odd, particularly for those of you who are situated in a STEM environment. This may be a slightly, well, let's just say it's opening the possibility if you're thinking about assessment and social justice in these terms. So I just invite you to hold this thought with generosity as we go through this talk. So along this, we sort of conceived of three nested ways of looking at assessment, and this certainly these three categories are supported in the data that we have found, and I'll talk to the data in a minute. Is this notion of assessment as being somewhat very much focused on the self. The second category then is assessment in relation to the discipline, and what we would have seen as the most sophisticated category as assessment having some relation to society. So those then get defined in these ways. The orientation to the self, for example, is that assessment helps me to learn. So that's, I mean, yeah, let me just leave that there for the moment. I'll come back to that in a minute. Orientation to the discipline or profession. Assessment prepares me for working in the profession. And orientation to society is that assessment is preparing me to make the world a better place. And you can see that those are very broad categories, but hopefully it's also possible to see that those are somewhat nested. So just a couple of words about the data collection, and if you want to know more about this, there's full detail of exactly how the data collection happened is detailed in the paper. We had, as I said, semi-structured interviews with students, to which we asked them to bring a piece of assessed work. So that would be something like a tutorial, maybe a test. Later on, that could be elements of a larger project. And we asked them to bring that so that we could ask them to discuss it and ask them to talk to it. Now, the discussion on assessment was maybe 5 to 10 minutes of part of a much larger interview. As you've seen, this is a large project. So that was the one element. The second element of data collection was lecture recordings. Each year of recording in each year of data capture, I should say, in each program, we took a lecture recording from one of the lectures, one of the sort of core lectures that would have been part of the program. And then we had interviews with the lecturer who gave that lecture. And finally, we also had interviews with somebody involved in that program who could sort of speak to the history of the program and what they thought they were doing with the program, so that we weren't sort of putting things onto the degrees or misunderstanding their intention of the degrees. In terms of this particular project, this paper was written at a point where we had data from years 1 to 3 in South Africa, but only South Africa and England, but only the first 2 years in the United States. What then happened was that using in vivo, various subsections were coded into student experience. Other codes were used for other areas. And what we looked at to make the initial categorization between self-discipline and society was a part of the interview, which was then subcoded assessment. For every single interview, and that is just over 400 interviews, well, 427 interviews, I think, were coded using those three categories. And in addition, what we did, because our key interest here was in looking at how the orientation to society either developed or didn't, the full transcripts were read of all of the students who we had classified as having an orientation to society. And that generated student stories. The student stories I'm just going to touch on here. The student stories themselves we're working on another paper that's focused on that data. But just looking at sort of what this showed. So orientations to self, unsurprisingly, this was the dominant category. And in fact, 303 out of the 427 interviews were coded as having an orientation, primarily an orientation to self. But just to be clear, that orientation to self is not necessarily a problematic position. And the example here is Rafia from year 1 Chem Eng at European University, which is one of the English universities. He writes, for an assessment, for example, when I was in high school, I used to think that the purpose of assessment was to show the teachers that you can do it. Look, I'll get this mark. Since I've come to university, I've seen that it's about making the knowledge stronger in your head for the future years. So, I mean, that in terms of moving from a sort of an extrinsic reward to an intrinsic reward, there's really no problem there with Rafia's position. That's, if most of our students could get to that position, we would be quite happy. So the orientation to self is not necessarily a problematic position. It's just from the viewpoint of an orientation towards social justice, it's a limited position. Orientations to discipline, essentially what we were looking for here was something that pointed towards either assessment tasks that help them, either they feel that assessment tasks have helped them to think or behave as a chemist or a chemical engineer, or they have a sense that this is good preparation for going into the profession. Unsurprisingly, this orientation to discipline does increase the number of students that we're seeing having this orientation increases over the years. So they're around about 20% in first and second year, and that increases to around about 40% in the third year. So, you know, there's, again, no difficulty there. I think that's what we would expect to see. What we had expected to see, or what we had hoped to see, was that orientation to society also increased in appearance over the years. Just one more thing about the orientation to discipline. It's important to say that there is an influence here of curriculum and assessment design. So 3 of the 4 UK sites have a big project in the third year. And so this is Leo, again, from one of the English universities, the other one from which we've called Erbium University. Right, I think the design project is probably going to be the most useful. I'm finding it really difficult, but I do think you do learn more from challenging yourself. I think the design project is the most close to what life is going to be like in the future, actually in the field. You'll be working with teams trying to design something. So this is very typical, and particularly within chemical engineering, the design project is an element either in the 3rd or 4th year, depending on the country. And is in fact quite close to what many of them will have to go out to do in the field, and the students clearly recognize that. Perhaps somewhat distressing is that less than 5% of the students end up with an orientation to society. And most of those, the comments are fleeting or tangential, and often not in terms, they don't recognize that orientation to society with the purpose of assessment in general. It's most often in discussion with a particular assignment. So I think what's good for us in South Africa is that orientation to society was found most commonly in South Africa, with 8 of the 21 students coming from one program, which is chemical engineering at what we've called Samarium University. In this particular case, while social justice is so often thought about in terms of, particularly in the light of either the decolonization conversation or the Black Lives Matter movement, is often seen in terms of race or social justice. But in this case, it was very strongly linked to water scarcity. And given when the project was running and the particular issues in various parts of the country at the time with water scarcity, this is probably not a great surprise. When we interviewed the lecturer, it was quite clear that they had made it within this particular program, they had made a deliberate intention to show students that a career in chemical engineering was not confined to big business alone. So they within this particular program, they've also got a very strong focus on environmental issues. So in one sense, this is no great surprise. But if we pull out this program with this one very particular link, our numbers fall even further. So clearly, this orientation to society is not really happening very much. This is an example, Nati from Samarium University, from this chemical engineering program. He writes, I think they are to again develop us to be holistic learners. And I think the projects also are to keep us engaged about what is going on around us and how we can impact people in the community and provide solutions and change the situation in that regard. So he's talking very much there about that project. And another student, when asked about the purpose of assessments, again, from the same program, says the assignments are also more, I feel, to get us to know what's happening outside of our studies, what's actually happening in the real world. So with chemical engineering, for example, this year, we've been focusing a lot on water because of the water crisis. So orientations to society, perhaps unsurprisingly, more orientations, and I say this as a chemist, right? So it's unsurprising to me that the orientation to society is seen more often in chemical engineering than in chemistry, for the very simple fact that chemical engineering is more directly, more explicitly linked to society than chemistry. Obviously, as a chemist, I think that chemistry is everywhere, but I understand why that orientation to society would be found more often in chemical engineering. Also interesting, and we're not making any argument on this, we're just noticing it, that it was found more commonly with women than with men. Perhaps most distressingly low, and this is the thing that we did not expect to find, is that orientations to society were most common in the first year, which is somewhat distressing because I think we were kind of hoping that their engagement in higher education, and certainly with my own passion of sort of ideas of critical citizenship, I would certainly hope that this orientation to society would in fact increase over the years, but alas, that was not the case. Just a few more comments then on orientation to society. There is a strong perceived connection between chemical engineering and balancing economic and environmental issues. And again, we don't find that quite so explicitly in chemistry. Institutions do build an environmental sensibility into the curriculum, and this is frequently reflected in assessment tasks. But, and this is the bit that I think gives us pause for thought, students rarely make this connection explicit when discussing that assessment, and do so even less often as their degree progresses. So the point of this is to say that even in those cases where there is an explicit link, and at the example there would have been from Samarium University, where they had a specific project looking at ways of dealing with water scarcity, which was an issue at the time, students still don't make those connections with social justice. And let me be clear here, we're not looking for those words social justice, we're just simply looking at an orientation to broader society. They're not actually making those, or relatively few students are making those links. So the questions that we then have in response to this then are, have these students come to university with an orientation to society, they apply to assessment and then lose it somewhere along the way? And the second question there is, why are some students making this connection to society and others are not? Even when they're students sitting in the same program, sometimes with an assessment that is strongly designed to connect to society. So just a couple of student stories, and as I say, I'm very briefly touching on this. There is another paper in the works that looks at the students, in particular those students who showed some orientation to society somewhere along the way, to look at what's happened to them in their trajectory through this particular university course. So the first one is Harrison, who's from one of the English universities, and he's studying chemistry. He begins with and continues with a social orientation. And this is allowed to flourish through assessment in the third year, but only due to a procedural accident. In fact, what happened with this student is that he ended up getting a project that he really didn't want to do, ended up engaging with this project, and then discovered that actually he was actually in the end very excited about the potential possibility. It was a medicinal chemistry project, the potential possibility of this having an impact on the real world. Our sort of rather sad story is Scarlett, who comes from Sodium University, also studying chemistry. She starts off with a very strong social orientation. She's here to study chemistry, to make a difference in the world. And in the first year, it's tangentially linked with assessment. But by the time she gets to her third year, she just wants to finish the degree and get on her way. It's kind of a rather, maybe a cautionary tale. It is just one of the students that we're looking at. Third student who's kind of interesting is Nina. I apologize for the noise in the corridor. Nina has a consistent and strong social orientation, very much nurtured by the course framework and ethos. Nina's doing chemical engineering at Sumerian University, so it seems to be a good fit for her, and is able to link that to assessment all the way through. It's kind of very interesting to look at that. So in terms of just touching on the student stories here, my intention is just to say there's more to come in this space, and watch this space, because I think that the next paper is also going to be very, very interesting in this regard. So emerging issues then, just going back to situating this study within the context of the broader project. What is interesting as the project emerges is that the connections between the various elements of this project are going to be very interesting. There are already connections between the society work and the knowledge work, the society and the personal project work. So sometime towards the middle of next year, we will be sort of pulling all of these different papers together into a single whole to hopefully tell something of a story of what is happening in these programs. So that's sort of the grand thing. But in terms of assessment, what this project, I think, most clearly shows us is that there are two different ways in which we can think about assessment. And I think that the one is to look at assignments linked explicitly to social issues. So that project that happened at Sumerian University, linking sort of an engineering project linked to water scarcity, would be an example of such a thing. That may or may not be useful within the program. But I think where a much more important question is around the value proposition of assessment. So we have to recognize that students are profoundly shaped by competitive assessment strategies. And whether or not those assessments link explicitly to social issues, if you're teaching I don't know, physical chemistry, linking an assignment specifically to a social issue may not make a lot of sense in terms of knowledge building within physical chemistry. But looking at the value proposition of the assessment may well merit some significant thought. So my point here is that it isn't simply the task that we need to consider. We need to consider the relationships and dispositions of the students, of the nature of the task, and what is the purpose. Essentially what I'm trying to say here is that traditional assessment is competitive, high stakes, and individual. And certainly in all of the programs that we've looked at, this remains the primary way of assessing. Is essentially what an example of what I'd be talking about there would be, say, an exam, and that exam counting a substantial amount of the mark for that particular course. The difficulty here is that it distorts our sense of achievement, where achievement is then something. Let me just say, it distorts our sense of achievement. And I want to point to two alternative possibilities, both really talking to the same thing. The work of Bowd on evaluation judgment. That is the student developing the capacity to evaluate their own understanding? If our assessment is not enabling this kind of evaluation judgment, I'm not sure we are in fact, even if they can pass the exam, I'm not sure we're giving them the kind of reflective capacity that they would need in order to be able to evaluate their capacity to problem solve out in the real world. And for those of you who know my work a little bit will know that I draw quite heavily on the work of Bernard Lonergan and his model of understanding, where one looks at one's experience, then looks at sort of the moment of insight. One has to critically evaluate that moment of insight by looking back at, do I actually understand this? And if I do, well, then what are the consequences of that? So I think there are several models here that can be usefully incorporated in using either Lonergan or Bowd to develop a better model of helping to help the student to really evaluate their own capacity. That we still need formal assessment because we still need ways in which to test whether the student actually does understand. But I think if we shift our thinking towards evaluation judgment, it could help STEM disciplines in particular think significantly more usefully about the ways in which they can deal with assessment in a way that moves beyond the self towards what can I contribute ultimately to society or ultimately to the team that I'm going to be working with. So just to end off there, as I say, this is part of a much larger project, and the next year or two is going to be I'm very excited to see how this is all going to shape out as various drafts of various papers from the teams get circulated. It really, the wealth of information coming from this project is truly exciting for chemistry and chemical engineering in particular, but for STEM disciplines more widely. So it just remains to give thanks to the Economic and Social Research Council from the UK, who funded the project, and the NRF, who funded elements of the South African dimension of that, And this year is the project team. The last time we were able to meet in person in Lancaster at the end of 2019. So thank you very much. I hope I've given you some idea of what we've been talking of this particular paper, and I'd be delighted to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blackie, for that. Very, very insightful, and wow, such a large project, and some great findings coming through as well. I'm just going to leave. I know you've got a rush, so you've got like 15 minutes here. So please, if you'd like to, Anthea and I handling the questions for now, and Tabang is also will be checking the chats for your questions. So if you want to raise your hand, and you can please go ahead and ask your question. You've just got Dr. Blackie for the next 15 minutes, so please ask your questions. Just checking any hands. I don't see anything at the moment. You can ask your questions. Any questions? This is.
So perhaps I should go, Rosaline, this is Anthea.
Hi, yes.
Perhaps I should go
Yes.
with a question to Mags. Mags, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Like Rosaline said, a huge project and great findings coming out from that project. I was wondering if perhaps at this point you have any suggestions of how one could encourage students to develop an orientation more towards society in our assessments. Any suggestions?
Yeah, Anthea, I think it's the big challenge, and I think that it really has to be something that's embedded that in a meaningful way that's going to be subject specific. So in some areas it's going to be very easy to say, ooh, as a simple thing, you can ask something in an assessment that is related to the real world. So for example, I teach organic chemistry. Simply asking questions in a way that say, we're trying to make this particular drug molecule, how do you go about it, is a very simple way of showing students that this is in fact related to society and can make an impact in society. But I think that alone will not do the job. I think there's a deeper question here for me, and this is one of the things that in a separate project that I'm working on within my own teaching context is really developing ways of assessment that require collaboration between the students, so that there is a sense of students beginning to become more aware of what they're bringing to the table and what they can contribute. So it's not simply group work. It's really encouraging them to think about what different ways to do that. So different contexts are going to have different elements of that, but I think that beginning to think about Baude's notion of evaluation judgment, for me, I think is the key thing to grapple with from a STEM environment. How do we help students get to know what they know and the limitations of their knowledge? That for me, I think, will be the crucial element. Why? Because that will help them when they go out into society, knowing when they can say, I've got this, and when they can say, ooh, I need to ask for help. So, and also encouraging them to assist one another, I guess, is the other thing. So a colleague of mine we're putting together a presentation for the Circle conference saying, forget how he's basically encouraging them to cheat, not badly, but encouraging them to help one another to get to good answers. I see there are a couple of other questions.
Yeah, we've got Manji, I think it's a student, Manji Sukena. You can go ahead. I hope I pronounce your name correctly.
Hi, yes, yeah, and thank you. It's Sukaina Manji from Lancaster University. So thank you very much for your thoughts, Man. I like the concept of where you talk about building the blocks, and I can see that actually visualizing in any other subject as well. So my question to this is the assessment perspective. Were there any cultural differences that were particularly noted? Because I noticed that one of your comments that you picked up was that the student is actually saying that earlier it was just for the teachers, but now I'm doing it because I want to know, or under something around that line. So were there any cultural differences that you particularly noticed out there? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think so. So no, we didn't find significant differences between the different places. The only difference was that in the one particular program where they emphasized this issue of water scarcity, but there wasn't actually a major difference between the ways in which students in the US or the ways in which students in England or the ways in which students in South Africa spoke about assessment. It was actually fairly common.
All right, thanks for that question and also for the response, Mags. I'm now going to ask Rita to pose a question. You're welcome to go ahead, Rita.
Sure, I think, I don't know, some comments as well, but thank you so much for that. I think, you know, the social justice issues is what we claim for in our curriculum, in our broad aims, but we never seem to unpack it and bring it down to the level of the activities that we want to engage with. So we start off with these bright ideas about engaging the dispositions and what we want to build. But I think we leave it there and we leave it on documents and never get that translated. So I like the examples that you gave as well. And what I want to bring attention to is that sometimes, you know, by concentrating just on one course, we actually silence the journey of the student through a program. And, you know, the value of what you're providing us to rethink the assessment in terms of social justice issues and projects around that could be really a great value add if you think of a student carrying a project or a group carrying a project through the years, you know, increasing the collaboration and looking at how then we can divide the assessment marks, or, you know, if there's marks to be assigned, how we can do that across. So are there any suggestions to that? Have you worked on any of those collaborations where you could look at something across a program, or just have you looked at it just from a course perspective?
So at this point, so I guess it gets difficult talking about programs and courses. So within our context, the program would be the entire degree course, right? So for the purposes of this project, we were looking across the entire degree trajectory, rather than looking at a specific module, I suppose. So we're still very much in the space of looking at the data and seeing what's emerging from the data. Hopefully in time we will have, particularly when this interacts with the knowledge group paper, I think there are going to be some interesting findings that come when we start bringing this, or interesting suggestions that come when we start bringing these various aspects of this project into conversation with one another. But at this stage, I don't have a good answer to your question, except that it's on our radar and we're still looking at that.
Thank you so much for that, and I'm sure we also will all be looking forward to what comes out of this. Thank you.
Tabang, you've got a question from the chat.
Yes, there's a question from R. Shupner. Do we as academics or teachers need to make explicit the attributes, disposition, or orientations that we are trying to develop, or do we sort of expect students to work it out themselves? That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, I fairly strongly believe that if we're wanting to develop some kind of sense of orientation to society, if we're not talking about it in the lecture theatres, very much sort of the John Dewey approach that if we're not aiming for it, we're certainly not going to achieve it. So if that's not part of the discourse in the lecture theatre, we really can't expect it to appear. It might appear in some students, but if so, it'll do more by accident than intent. And I'd rather be intentional about it. Whether that happens with more students, I think it's more likely then that students will be aware of it. So again, for example, when I teach organic chemistry, I'll make sure that I talk about this is how this might connect, and the aspirin that you dissolved to take away your headache. That's the thing that we're trying to make today, theoretically, or whatever that is. So I think connecting to the real world becomes important. One doesn't have to labor that point, but I think where they're clear connections that they should be made.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Tabang, have you found any other questions in the chat?
Not yet. I think, yeah, it's just an engagement in the chat, but no specific questions.
So I think, Margaret, I work in a faculty where you've got accounting and information technology. So at the moment, we're looking at decolonizing, going through that process of decolonizing the curriculum. It's a process. And I found that staff are actually grappling, with making that connections there. So when we look at those type of subjects, for example, accounting, what advice would you give to that particular lecturer that's in the accounting or maybe in information technology about, what can they do in terms of, orienting the student to society and what's happening in society, making that kind of link? Because I find that staff really grappling with that, especially in those two disciplines that I'm working with.
Sure. So, I mean, I think today in South Africa, the connection between accounting and decolonization and accounting and ethics is certainly quite clear. So I think that there are lots of things that one can do in terms of saying this is, we have to be rigorous about these things. So in terms of accounting in particular, to say, how we view ourselves in terms of accounting means that we need to think about our role in society and what it is that we're going to be going out there doing. And if our goal is simply to support the capitalist system, then I think there's a big problem. If our goal is to make as much money as we possibly can, then we might there may be consequences to that. So I think that there certainly, if we look, the connection between those fields and ethics is very strong, and the situation in our country at the moment makes that very clear. So I think that the issues that have been brought by the focus on making money at all costs and letting the market take care of itself, which is the legacy of sort of the Reagan and Thatcher era. I think it's quite clear that there are we have some problems that we need to overcome, and we need to think about how we move forward as a country. What does it mean? What does Ubuntu mean in such a system? So I think it just takes a little bit of creative thinking there. And again, I've done some work, particularly on decolonization myself in science. And for me, the thing on science is we're not going to change the content of what we teach, but we can, things like helping students recognize that their mental models are profoundly influenced by the way in which they grew up and the toys that they played with and all of those kinds of things. So that my the mental models that I have in my head are not the normative ones, I say, hey, this is how I explain this to myself. How do you? Chat to one another, figure that out. Now, let's look at some of these models and see which ones work and which ones don't. A simple act like that then changes the conversation fairly significantly and helps the student to begin to become aware of their own knowledge creation process, which I think is a key part of the whole decolonization conversation.
Thanks so much. Anthea, Tabang, any questions that you're finding in the chat?
Rosaline, there is a last question. I think we might have time for one more question by Karen Ferreira Meyers. Would the low response in the... Yeah, perhaps you can unmute yourself and then just pose a question. Karen, are you there? The low response to society, could that somehow be linked to the type of students found in chemistry or engineering programs, privileged backgrounds perhaps, or is that a misunderstanding of today's context?
Yeah, to be honest, the students come from a wide variety of backgrounds. I don't think that that's necessarily. I think, I don't think it's as simple as coming from privileged backgrounds, because certainly a good number of students involved in the project would not come from privileged backgrounds. So I'm going to have to apologize. I'm going to have to dash off.
Yes.
Sorry to do this, but it's just, I've got an opportunity to have a
Thanks so much, Mark. We want to just thank you before you leave. 1 minute, thank you. Thank you so much. And I have sent a link, for everyone to pull in. So maybe if they need some clarity, we could do maybe a further session to unpack particular things. But thank you so much, for leading the discussion on how we can connect the self, the discipline, and society. And we wish you well, and we hope to see you soon. Yeah,
thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah,
thank you, Max.
Okay.
Go well. Thanks.
Take care. Yeah, so we just want to continue the conversation for maybe next 5 minutes. If there's anything else that maybe you'd like to speak about regarding our topic. Anyone? It's like, when you're in the class and everything is so quiet. Yeah, so I think it's important, to make those links, because sometimes we kind of have this textbook approach to our module. We have, particular things, and we need to really think out of the box in terms of our assessments as well, and how we can link the assessments to what is happening in society, so students see that link. And I think learning becomes more meaningful when students can make the link to the world in which they live in. Yes, Reka, please go ahead.
Hi, Rosaline, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if I heard Dr. Blackie mentioning that background of students does not matter. Did I hear right? The background of students.
I missed that. Anthea?
I'm not sure, but she did refer to context and the importance thereof. And I think that might imply that students' backgrounds do matter. But something must have triggered the question, Reka. Maybe you should perhaps explain.
Yeah. I think it was
I'm just imagining that I heard saying background does not matter, because I beg to differ there, because I really feel the background of students does come to play when we actually administer or we design assessments. The type of assessments is dependent on what students bring to higher education context. What they have learned and how they were taught previously comes to play in how they are going to produce or to be assessed or want to be assessed. So I think the background factors that are huge, it's multi-layered, and there are lots of factors that do come into play. Thanks.
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to open a debate on this.
Yeah, I think Question?
Sorry, can I come in?
Yes, please do.
It's Sukaina here. Yes, I think what Rekha mentions is an important point, because the background would actually be guiding learning adventures as well. And I was quite surprised that within the research, they couldn't find any cultural differences towards assessment. I would have really thought that there would have been different approaches, especially in a cultural context, to how people approach assessment as well.
Yeah, but I'm sure you see this is still a research that's unfolding. So I'm sure that's maybe those findings might surface as they dig deeper into the data. Anyone else? Can't see hands. Nareen, go ahead.
Oh, I was actually, thank you so much, Rosaline, and thanks for arranging this. It was most interesting. I was just responding to what Rekha was asking. Her response was actually to a question on the low response in the area of self and society being linked to the students in chemistry programs, who it was assumed, I think it was Karen that had posted this, that they may come from privileged backgrounds, and that's when she responded with the negative. I was just trying to clarify that point.
Yes,
she didn't actually say that background doesn't matter, but what she did say was that they were not necessarily privileged, the chemical engineering people. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I can see some comments. Yeah, I think everyone's agreeing with that as well. Yeah, and I was going to say that, and I think we had a comment on that. So anyone else would like to just raise any other issues that came up in today's webinar, or maybe something that's related? Maybe you've got examples in your module of things that you do to make that connections with society, the orientations to society. So what is it that you do to connect the self, the discipline, and society? Maybe so we can have some examples so that it actually becomes clear for everyone. Anyone? Anyone want to give it a go? This is part of professional learning, so it's about sharing. Yes, Lulu, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosaline. I'm just laughing because I just asked the students the question, and I wasn't even aware that it's something oriented to the society. You know, like I'm teaching internal auditing, and we talk a lot of fraud that is taking place in our country. And I just asked the student what difference will they will make when they go out as internal auditors. I was just surprised that the students know so much about what is happening. So even within their local governments and all. So I think I will go on and dig more on such questions of which they will be able to connect with their society. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jali. Sharon, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosaline. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm not sure if this counts, but in my previous lectures with financial management, and we covered a bit of ethics in there, I would ask the students about the news reports they would see going around about corruption, perhaps in government or in certain industries, and I'd ask them, if you were in that position, would you allow yourself to take a bribe or anything? And they were like, no, they could never do that. Then I'd say, okay, let's say that you're in your workplace and you have a child that needs certain stationery. So when you need stationery and it's just a paper, just a ruler, just a pen, what do you do? And they're like, I'm just going to take it. That does not count. Then I was like, okay, you're starting off, it might start off as a small aspect. So those people in society or in those positions may have thought, okay, there's nothing wrong with it at this point, but gradually it grew up. But it kind of made them think, okay, so when we say ethics and we read what ethics is defined as is in the textbook, how do I take that and apply it to my particular module, and then from there take it to my workplace when I start working? but it was a very engaging discussion with the students, and I just thought to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, and I think we kind of put things into compartments, you know. We might have those open discussions, but how do we link it to our curriculum? How do our assessments actually make those links? And I think sometimes students struggle because they separate what they're learning in the classroom with what is happening in the world. And I think it's important to make those connections, and it actually helps the students to learn and also see how they can make a contribution to society. And I always say that the university is the catalyst for change, that we are the ones that, you know, especially with the unrest that happened recently, we were looking at the university. What is the role of the university, if not to make a change in society? And we're there in that space, and we can use the curriculum, we can use assessments, you know, those discussions, those rich discussions in the classroom to effect change within our society. And Rita says, I do think assessments need to be open enough to enable all backgrounds and knowledges, community, self, cultural, spiritual, etc., to be brought. Of course, our structural and resource limitations play a role here when we have large classes. Yes. And William Gillian says, Gillian, agree, pervasive skill in accounting science is critical, ethics, skills development. This must be infused in module design and development in assessments. Yeah, so thank you for those comments. Anthea, anything you want to add, Tabang? Anything that I've missed in the chat that's coming through?
Nothing from my side, Rosaline. I think there are a couple of really interesting comments that have been made in the chat, and it makes for good engagement and interesting discussion. But I do notice that people are leaving the meeting space, or they're starting to leave the meeting space. So perhaps we should wrap up if there's nothing else. Thanks, Rosaline.
Yeah, thank you so much. Taban, anything from your side?
No, nothing from my side. Just to remind the colleagues to complete the feedback form. The link has been shared in the chat.
Yes. So thank you so much. Just one announcement from HELTASA that we've extended the call for proposals for the HELTASA Unconference, which is being held this December. So it's extended till the end of September. So you have 1 month more to, prepare a proposal to make the change, let our voices be heard. We're changing in HELTASA. We want to hear your voices. What are you doing in the classroom? What are you doing within your context? And we've got a variety of ways in which you can participate. Rita, you want to just chat quickly, 2 minutes on the ways in which people can engage at this year's Unconference?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Rosaline. Thank you for the pitch as well, and everybody who's still remaining. We'd love to hear your voices, ideas, thoughts, even if they're just emerging at the conference this year. We want to open up the space exactly like we said, for a new diversity to come through, for new emerging ideas, so that we can, it's complex. The assessment, the curricular, teaching and learning spaces in higher education have become even more complex. And I think together we can find new possibilities and new ways of just conversing and dialoguing, so that we can reach some ideas that we'd like to see going on in our practices. And thereafter, again, have the opportunity, when there's success or even challenges for that matter, and how we overcome that, to be able to write about that as well. So what we want to open up the space in this year's conference is for new ways of how you would like to participate in conversations, in dialogues around issues that may not even be solved as yet, but you want to engage in that conversation to be able to find new ideas when you go back to your practice spaces. At the same time, we also want to open up the space for collaborative engagement that could occur across our national spaces. So we ask you to please look at the website. All the information is available there, and we encourage you all to participate. Thank you so much, Rosaline and Anthea. And yeah, just by the way, we've also restructured HELTASA, and Rosaline, Anthea, and Tabang belong to a project called the Professional Development Project. This is Professional Learning Project, and we also welcome those of you interested to get behind. Call them, send them an email, and you can become active members within this project as well.
Yes,
thank you, Rosaline.
You so much. Thank you. That was Rita, our Vice Chair of HELTASA. I think Kasturi was here earlier. She's the chairperson of HELTASA. And so we also, as part of our professional learning project, we've got a book project as well that we're working on. We did send a call out to the community. Our call did close, but for those of you who still want to submit an abstract, we're giving you till next week, Monday, to submit an abstract. It's about COVID and what happened, what are some of your learnings, your professional learning, with what happened during this period of COVID. So if you're interested, you can send us an email or go and check your inbox. You would see that we did advertise. It was advertised. It's on HELTASA website as well. So if anyone's still passionate, you want to share something, it's a short piece, maximum 3,000 words. It's peer reviewed, and it's the OER publication. But we are complying with DHET regulations as well. So thank you. I just want to close. I don't want to keep you too long. I know we're going from one meeting to the next. So I do want to thank my team. That's Anthea Jacobs and Tabang, for your assistance as well. Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Blackie again for being part of our webinar. Thank you to everyone that attended. We really value your input, we value your support, and we value your sharing as well. And as I said, become part of the Professional Learning Project. We are here to learn together. And if you think that there's something that you are doing within your space that you'd like to share on this type of platform, and this is a national platform. We've also had some international guests today as well. So it's a good platform, for you to come and share your ideas. And this is why we're here. So please do. And again, going back to our webinar, let us explore ways, of how do we connect, the self, the discipline, and society within our modules and within our programs. So I just want to switch on my camera so we can see you and you can see me. And I want to wish you well, and till we see each other again at our next HELTASA event. Take care and goodbye, everyone.
Rosaline, one moment, please.
Yes.
Alzette is putting the link for the conference in the chat space.
Okay. So if you've not, so there's the link to our conference. Please do sign up, send in your proposals. As I said, I'm just going to put my email here. So for those of you who want to send me an abstract, it's 300 words. Or you can send me an email and I'll send you the call. Okay, so you're going to switch your camera. We've got 5 minutes. You can stop recording, Anthea.
Nalini has a hand up, Rosaline.
Okay, yes, go ahead, Nalini.
Hi, Rosaline. Can I just find out for this conference, this is unpublished work or published work?
You're talking about the conference that's forthcoming?
Yes.
It can be published work as well.
Okay.
So it's sharing what you've done thus far. There is a special journal that we will be doing a call for some publications there for some of the presentations that were made. But if you've published work, you're welcome to share your work with us as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So take care, everyone. We've stopped the recording and we just got a free space. If anyone wants to